The Committee of the Whole is back in order. Um, Senator Estevez, if I could get your indulgence and let's hold on your Amendment 8 and 9 and allow you and Senator Espaldon and Senator Nelson to work on how you all want to try to divide up the TAF increase. But right now, let's continue to work on the cuts that you want. I mean, that was the criticism yesterday, is we're not making enough cuts, so let's get to 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, no, at this time I will move to table, well, one at a time, table Amendment 8, the one we're currently on.
Okay, hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I'd like to table Amendment number 9.
Hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment 10 is a proposal, same thing, 23% reduction of 2018 general fund appropriation. This one is towards Bureau of Budget and Management, and the proposed number will be $991,381, and the reduction is $121,193. And again, while I do intend to appropriate that money to GDOE, until we've confirmed and voted on the reduction, again, I'm open to whatever the body wants to do and wants to entertain. But that's the amendment as it's written right now, is a reduction in their general fund appropriation of $121,193.
All right, on Amendment 10 to BBMR's appropriation to reduce it. Any senator wish to be heard on it? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to first open with a few questions. The first question I can perhaps posit to either you as Budget Chair or to the mover of the amendment. And the first question is, the Bureau of Budget and Management Research, this is an office that's basically under the office of the governor, is that correct?
Physically, it's all at Adelup, but it has its own separate appropriation line.
It has its own separate appropriation, but it's not a separate agency of the government. It's an office, it's a sub-office within the office of the governor.
I think they are statutorily created, and their employees, say for the director, are all classified.
So for the Bureau of Budget and Management Research, the appropriation reduction would impact the classified employees as well within the office.
Yeah. Yes.
That's, well, I'm not to be obstinate, Mr. Chairman, but that's just a line in the sand for me when we're talking about classified employees. When we were talking about the Office of the Governor at the beginning of the discussions today, the entire operation of there is unclassified. And for us now to be cutting the budgets that would fund the salaries of classified workers, that's going into a whole new area as far as I'm concerned. And so unless we can somehow filter how much is funding the unclassified service within this area and how much is funding the classified service, I'm having a difficult time getting behind supporting a reduction that would impact classified employees.
Thank you. Yes. Any other senator wish to be heard on Amendment 10? None. Did you wish to close or no? We'll call the question. Is that you're just going to vote no? You're not objecting, or is there? Yes, there is an objection. All right. All those in favor of the BBMR cut, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on, Amendment 11, same logic and methodology. It's a proposed new general fund amount will be $811,553. The variance is $121,616.
And Amendment 11 is to the Civil Service Commission. So any senator wish to be heard? Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, just like the other amendments, if the intent is to target the personnel, this is one agency that we really should have a second look at not touching personnel, especially with the cases that are coming before the civil service. It's important that that they remain whole. However, if there is any cuts, which I would support if an amendment to the amendment is passed, is that this 121,000 reduction is taken from operations, and that could be anywhere from office space rental, which the digest here says it's about 150,000 a year. I don't know if this is an updated digest, but I would move to make an amendment to this amendment that it be focused on operations, and if we need to spell it out specifically, then on office rental. There's places that we that should be able to find to get out of that wherever they're at right now. So that's my amendment to the amendment.
All right, on the Rodriguez amendment to the Estevez amendment, any senator wish to be heard?
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, could you just repeat that amendment?
As I understand it, and I stand to be corrected, Senator Rodriguez is recommending or moving that the 121,000 be taken from operations as opposed to personnel. And I would inform the body that currently in operations, their rent is $152,400. For rent, yes. Senator Munoz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm reading in 323, it said, because I know he's just going to change the amount, but it does say here is appropriated from the general fund to the Civil Service Commission for its operations for fiscal year 2019. So I'm not sure how much more specific did he want a breakdown of the appropriation? I'm not sure.
I think it was just reduce it by that 121,000, and they'll have to figure out where it comes from. I leave it up to all of you.
Yes, so the amendment to the amendment is to be specific that the 121,000 reduction come from operations object categories 220 to 290.
So if we're on page 52, everybody, he wants to reduce the total general fund appropriation on line 8, and then on line 14 to subtract the 121 from there. Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand. If we subtract the $121,000 from operations object category, and you're stating that that really base for their rent, which is at 152, the difference between what 271 and 152 is roughly about, I guess, 121. So basically, they only have enough for rent and personnel. I guess the question then becomes, in the deliberations of the Civil Service Commission, do they ever need to hire outside personnel or legal counsel or anything else to be able to assist in their operations, and whether that operations object category covers that amount?
Our good senator has given them the authority to hire an ALJ and legal counsel and those other operations, but OFB is ready to respond to give you the list of what we covered in the operations.
The Civil Service Commission for operations. Operations covers everything from travel through miscellaneous. So that's object category 220, 230, 240, 250, and so forth. So that's supplies, equipment, and so forth. In that, it also includes rent, which is 152,000. And so if you subtract that, the remaining would be about 120 or so. 67,000 of that is for the administrative law judge contract for the CSC. And then they have some supplies of about $3,000. And just to be specific, it's $3,439. And then for miscellaneous, they have their commissioner stipends of $28,800.
And that's what the total of 271 adds up to? Is that where it comes from?
Yes, and they have under contractual, they also have it looks like copier services as well. That makes up the difference.
Okay. And so if we do, just to be clear, if we do take $121,000 away from the object category of operations, then they will not be able to hire an administrative law judge. They would not be, I mean, they would basically just be able to make rent and personnel. That's all.
Well, it's either that or the opposite. They can be homeless but have the ALJ.
That presents a situation that might be untenable, though. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, I just want to remind ourselves, our colleagues, that on Section 8, page 138, there is a general transfer authority that the governor of Guam would have access to. So if, in fact, the funding mechanism is reduced for some of these specific categories, then that is a tool to be able to allocate resources to meet, at a very minimum, some of those requirements. So in terms of looking at some of these allocations and reallocations, certainly it's a tool that can be utilized to further reduce the cost of expenditures of this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on this Rodriguez amendment to isolate the 121 reduction to operations?
I object to the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Any other? Do you wish to call the question? All those in favor of the, first, the Rodriguez amendment. All those in favor of the Rodriguez amendment to the Estevez amendment, indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. On the Estevez amendment for the reduction of the 121 from the Civil Service Commission, all those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Senator Estevez, number 12.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next amendment I'm proposing is Amendment 12, Department of Administration, which proposes a new appropriation of $5,140,296. The reduction and the variance from the prior appropriation is $1,779,020.
On the Department of Administration reduction, anyone wish to be heard? Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, absent detail on what is or is not essential with respect to the particular agency, the agency at large is responsible for doing all of the hiring in the government of Guam. They process all of the line agency hires. This agency is responsible for making sure that all the revenue that's brought in by the government actually hits the necessary accounts. To cut this agency by this amount without being able to pinpoint exactly where these cuts are going to be earmarked towards, it just has me concerned. Only because if we're overcutting and it's going to negatively impact some of the critical functions, we already see 6-month delays in hiring as it is. If we were to turn these into 9-month delays, they could affect everything from police cycles to fire cycles to collection agents up at Rev and Tax. And we're always trying to get the agency to move a little faster, particularly in these critical areas. And absent knowing the full impact that this particular cut will have and whether or not it's going to encroach in some of those critical areas, I'm uncomfortable supporting this amendment at this time. If we are able to go in and itemize the amendment, or perhaps make the reduction more targeted to less critical areas and spell out those less critical areas that are going to be targeted, I can perhaps come around to it. But at this time, a 23%, almost a 1/4 reduction in force on this particular agency, I think would be a little too much to handle at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on this amendment? Senator, Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I echo the sentiments of the previous speaker. It's what I've been saying regarding all of these cuts, that if we want to cut the fat out of DOA, please show me where that is, because when they were here the last time, they talked about their procurement. They talked about their personnel. I think the Appropriations Committee hounded them on when they came in on their budget as to what was the delay in hiring. What are we going to do about delays in procurement? And they said they were pretty much operating in bare bones. And I remember the director telling us that cutting them anymore was going to have serious impact. So I just want to know, where did this amount come from? $1,500,000 from the Department of Administration it's a huge amount of personnel to cut, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to know which divisions we're cutting those personnel from.
Do you wish to yield?
I do. Actually, this one's a bit more unique. Because Department of Administration is such a massive agency, and they do have a history, before I speak about it, I'd just like to, with the caveat that I'm going to make the motion to table this and allow my colleagues a little more time. If you get an opportunity to look at the budget proposals, option 1, option 2, proposed for this, and you look at least the budget digest and the historical data, I think one of the things that kind of offsets it was their accounting for Office of Technology, which has thus been moved out. And so if you were to extrapolate the data and look at what the contractual services are, and what the personnel requirements are, I think the 1.7 million is either reasonable or really close. And so I don't want to just kind of cancel it out and we vote it off, I think I'd prefer to give the time to my colleagues to take a look at it on their own time with no rush and see if I'd be fine with DOA coming in here, and if we wanted to go with it with the fine-tooth comb to kind of discuss operations now and moving forward. And I think the approach of even looking at rent, because I don't know if the issue has come up that now that Office of Technology is their own agency, are we still paying for the same rental spaces? So I think there's a lot of questions that could potentially be answered. And so I don't want to necessarily dispose of this amendment yet, and if it's okay with the body, I'd like to table the discussion.
Mr. Speaker, then if you could clarify, for the substitute bill, did you include the Office of Technology people and contracts in your original amount?
Office of Technology has its own separate appropriation.
So those
for
were
its
already
rent.
deducted before you got to this amount?
It was not included in this.
Okay, so this would cut other divisions of the Department of Administration 1.7 million, not 1.5. I've been corrected, 1.7 million. I'd have to object, Mr. Speaker, without knowing which divisions we're cutting.
All right, there's been an objection. Any,
Point of order, Mr.
Yes.
Chair. There is a motion to table it, and if she's objecting to the tabling of this motion at this time, just because the author, the mover of this amendment, has asked for this particular amendment to be set aside.
okay. Is there an objection to setting this aside for right now? All right, hearing no objection, it's set aside. Number 13.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If it's okay with the body, I think that the next two amendments, Department of Agriculture and Department of Labor, they're kind of off a bit because they have special funds that offset, and since I focused on the general fund appropriation, I think these are two agencies that might require and warrant a little bit more looking into, and then we can maybe readdress it with the body. I mean, they're not significant cuts, but I believe there is wiggle room here for these cuts to either be adjusted or to be discussed a little bit further. And so I'd request to table items 13 and 14 as well, and I intend to move on with the rest.
If there's no objection. We are now on 15.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item 15, what this does is it removes the encumbrance of $100,000 in Territorial Educational Facilities Fund, which is appropriate to Department of Education, but it's encumbered to be deposited into the First Generation Trust Fund initiatives. I think it's a great program, but I think when we're considering financial crisis, I look at $100,000 as a teacher or school aids and one-to-one aids or other priorities of Department of Education towards operation, considering that they're going to be cut. So I think $100,000 would go a long way in these dire times. And so I want to remove the restriction on depositing that and make that, and just leave that in their overall budget, which I think would be available for operations.
On this amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard on the First Generation Trust Fund? Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I understand, but if we remove this specific appropriation, I guess what we're saying is we're leaving it to the discretion of the Department of Education to fund this or not. I'm just wondering if in law, since it is in law that this trust fund was created, right, whether they even have that option, or I guess it doesn't matter, right? This issue that I'm bringing up is moot in terms of whether we specifically fund it or not. It's still going to get funded by DOE.
The First Generation Trust Fund was passed 4 years ago. There were supposed to have been deposits made over those 4 years, and this year would actually be the first year that it was going to be utilized, not this. So I'll let OFB explain what's been happening over the last several years. And
All right.
I believe the First Generation Trust Fund Initiative, the Budget Acts in the past 4 years I believe 4 years, has funded these for DOE, UOG, and GCC. So I think the intent was that the appropriations were to fund based on the enabling statute for the First Generation Trust Fund Initiative. And I believe UOG was supposed to fund 250,000 of that. GCC was to do 200,000, and then DOE was to cover 100,000, so 450,000 per year. Based on the most recent information that I received from DOE, the balance in that fund is about $160,000, and so I guess the assumption is that UOG and GCC haven't been provided the funds to pay into the trust fund. Therefore, the balance is at just $160,000.
I think that what
I just, because even in the previous budgets, I'm wondering about that they weren't provided the funds, because at least DOE is a bit off, but the other ones were direct appropriations from TEF.
And it was supposed to. The problem was that you remember in the last 2 fiscal years, we've been screaming about the
We
fact
didn't collect the
that,
TEF, yeah.
that UOG and GCC never received their full appropriation level. In fact, this $13 million surplus we're in is because they've not received their funds. So there's been no money in there. Though we've appropriated in the last 2 budgets this amount, it's never been received by those 2 entities, and so they've not made the deposits. We may need, whoever has education oversight will probably have to do some review of that to try to figure out what's going on as to whether or not it can be implemented. But right now, they don't have enough money to be able to operate that. DOE was the only one that has made any deposits into this thing, and they only have 160. So if you want to move these, it really would be of no consequence because the cash has never been there to make the deposit.
Okay, and just a follow-up question, just for all of our edification. I understand the First Generation Trust Fund for students who may be going to GCC or UOG because of tuition costs. This First Generation Trust Fund for DOE, though, I imagine applies to public school students, in which there is no tuition. Why would there be a necessity, if you could just refresh our memory, why would there be a necessity for any money for a First Generation Trust Fund for a public school student going to GDOE school? Because they don't pay tuition. At least that's got to be a question that I'm going to ask.
OFB can address that.
Yeah, the enabling statute, from my recollection, I can't pull it up here in front of me right now, but the intent was that I think over 5 fiscal years, 450,000 was supposed to be put into a trust fund to be built up, and so that by the end of the 5th year or so, there would be a balance in there to be able to fund tuition for public school students that are graduating and attending either of the 2 higher education institutions, and so I think that's the intent of it. So the reason why 100,000 was from DOE is because the public school students, and this is my understanding of the intent, is that those public school students will be moving into higher education.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Nicholas, did you wish to speak? And then Senator Snogstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. If the law was established to accrue a balance and the balance was to be paid out to a specific beneficiary and that was all defined in the law, are we accruing an obligation to these students that's going to have to be paid out at a specific point in time, whether there is funds in the account or not?
I don't want to give legal advice, but there was supposed to be money put into this account. Unfortunately, when there was no cash, there was no cash. And UOG was shorted at 1.9 million, and then last year 6 million, but it's been substantial. So they just didn't have the cash to put into the children's college fund.
Right. I'm raising the point, Mr. Chairman, because if it comes down to it, and these students, when the time comes for them to receive the check that they're supposed to be entitled to under the law, don't receive it, are they able to file a suit for to receive the funds that are supposed to have been held in trust on their behalf by this government? And if we're opening ourselves up to a future liability, I mean, we can kind of shrug the lack of deposits over the past couple of years, but if it's going to turn around and have and potentially be legally compelled, then that's a problem. And it further underscores the other issue, Mr. Chairman, and that is that this is just another example of how we pass legislation and we appropriate for the we appropriate to fund the measure, and then it just doesn't happen. I mean, if there's any theme for this past year, it's the amazing practice of just completely ignoring law, just completely ignoring the requirements of the law. And it's not just happening over the last 12 months, it's coming out that these have been chronic challenges, whether it's transferring money out of special funds that shouldn't have been touched, or not depositing into the income tax refund trust account, or now not depositing into the first generation trust fund that's supposed to go to paying for students to go to school. And yet we're getting reports of surpluses when we have these accounts that are grossly deficient, and these laws that are getting blatantly ignored. So I'm at a loss, Mr. Chairman. Should we just repeal all these things that aren't being followed, or what do we do? I mean, and I think it really puts things into perspective. That it's one thing to put something into law; it's another thing for that law to be followed. And then what happens when people just don't follow the law? And what happens when it's the government that's not following its own law? And this is a question that we really need to come to terms with as we consider a budget, because why follow the budget? At what point is everything inconsequential? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, do you wish to address this?
Mr. Speaker, yeah, I oppose the amendment and two subsequent amendments he's going to introduce. Deals with UOG and GCC, all in reference to the first generation. If this is an indication that there's a cash management problem, every other amendment that he has submitted, we're going to have a cash management. So we can go in and believe that we're reducing our budget, but if there's no money, we didn't do nothing. This is just a paper drill, and I think we need to really take a look at how much money is really going to be there. No different than Tourist Attraction Fund. We went after the hot bun. If there's no 8 million, there's no 8 million. If it comes down to 5 or 6, everything we're doing is just a paper drill. Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard on this amendment? If not, you may close, Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea behind this and these initiatives is just to remove the encumbrances. I mean, combined, yes, granted, I understand with special funds and what we've seen with TEF is sometimes it just doesn't track and it just doesn't come in the way it's supposed to. But that doesn't mean that this year is going to be different. Every part of the budget is a best guess estimate. So it could very well come in And this 550,000 that would get deposited into the trust fund initiative could be used for operations at Guam Department of Education, considering they've had a significant reduction in their budget. 550,000 in available funding can go a long way. I understand the value of it sitting in a trust fund account, but you know, this goes back, and it's the same argument that I'm going to expound on with regards to reductions in UOG and Guam Community College. The data is there, and we've been told time and time again, our kids are not coming out of the public school system ready to go to college. The math level's not up there. The English level is not up there. So here we are with all these great initiatives to invest into college and scholarships and program this and program that. And most of the public school students are never going to be able to avail themselves to it. So I think overall, when we look at the adjustments in funding, I think, you know, with respect to the chairman, the funding is still in education. It's just reshifting a priority. I mean, and that's what we have to do when there's not a lot of money around, is figure out what our priority is. So if the data is showing that the kids coming out of public schools are not up to college level math, are not ready for college level math, not ready for college level reading, I think maybe we should look at reprioritizing assets from the colleges and universities back into our public school system to better prepare our children to get into these programs, to be able to compete for these scholarships. And so that's all I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to take anything from anyone. I think it's still in education. It's just a reshift in priorities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On the amendment, there's been an objection. All those in favor of the, did you wish to, I'm sorry. On the, all those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No change, same justification, 250,000, which is a direct appropriation of the TEF to the University of Guam for the specific purpose of depositing it into the first generation trust fund account. And so again, my motion is to remove that section so that funding is not encumbered, and it can be, well, if the body deems, can be dedicated and to Department of Education.
Okay, and before we take the vote, I want to make a correction. ORB had previously stated that the amount of money that was in the trust fund was $160,000. He's since been received a text that says that actually in the first generation trust fund there's $750,000. So I just wanted to make that correction publicly.
I'm sorry, how much was that?
$750,000.
Perhaps then, Mr. Chair, we can reconsider the actions of the body.
It didn't fail. I mean, the motion failed.
Yes, so can we reconsider now that we know the amount is 750,000? The amount is completely different.
If that's the motion that you wish to make.
Mr. Chairman, to clarify, I think based on that amount, I think that confirms then that money has been deposited into the account based on how we've been budgeting it over the last.
Well, 450 times 3 would be 13.5.
It should be
135.
450 times 3, because the total amount for the first generation trust is 550,000.
Or 550 times 3.
I see.
Would be 1.6. UOG and GCC have not been making their deposits.
Thank you. I'm no objection to reconsidering them.
But there's a
Action.
motion to reconsider if that's still. There's a motion to reconsider. Is there any objection to the motion to reconsider the vote that was taken on the DOE 100,000. Anyone, is there no objection to it? We'll reconsider it. All those in favor of removing this 100,000 from the DOE appropriation for the first generation?
To be specific, Mr. Speaker, it's appropriated to Department of Education, but it removes the requirement. They can put it in the 100,000 if they want. It changes the shall to a may, and it all depends on their operation. So if they have the money to deposit based on the TEF, they can. If they need it for other necessities or operational requirements, they can use it for that as well, and that's the intent. But the money's already appropriated to Department of Education.
Can we have a quick recess, Mr. Speaker? 30 seconds?
Yes, I just wanted to point out to the colleagues that Amendment 15 actually is to just completely delete that section in the, so.
Oh, yes,
It's
correct.
not a
But they're already appropriated the money, so it just falls into their regular operations. At least it should.
correct. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, the amendment is to delete it. Am I correct?
Correct.
So what's with this may and shall and whatever? It's to delete. I think that was the question, is to reconsider the vote to delete?
Correct.
That there was a unanimous vote that it
Okay.
failed, so why even reconsider it? I mean, I just curious.
If there was no objection to the reconsideration, I'll take the vote again.
Okay.
All those in favor of deleting the appropriation of 100,000 to the,
Mr. Speaker, it's just an allocation. It's the allocation of 100 from DOE's budget.
right,
And deleting this would allow DOE to keep it and allocate it if they want, or not allocate it if they don't want. But keep it in their budget. It's not
Correct.
changing their appropriation.
all those in favor? Oh, wait,
Sorry, just a question.
Mr. Speaker, I believe we're in the middle of a vote.
Is that?
all right, well, we're on the vote. Never mind. All those in favor? Motion fails. Year 16, Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This one removes the direct appropriation requirement to Department of Education, and it frees up $250,000 in Territorial Education Fund. However, this amendment does not place that $250,000. I think once we freed it up and unencumbered it, then I think it'd be up to the body, and I'm open to any suggestions on where it could be placed.
Okay, on this number 16 amendment to UOG, anyone wish to speak will be heard. Go, Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just wanted to clarify then. So this is the UOG. I remember when this bill was passed, or this law was passed, and that UOG was very much in favor of it. But you're saying that UOG's not made these deposits?
When they were short 6 million, they had other operations and they didn't get this specific amount for this.
This one is different than the previous section because this is an appropriation,
Correct.
not an allocation by UOG. This is us appropriating it. Mr. Speaker, why don't we just appropriate if they were going to appropriate it directly to the first generation trust fund as opposed to UOG for transfer and deposit into the trust fund.
Senator Nicholas, I wasn't the author of the legislation. I don't remember.
From my recollection, Mr. Chairman, the law was written in such a way as to involve UOG and GCC in the funding of the trust fund, and so by passing it through the university, it's accomplishing the requirements of the mandate that the funding technically come from those agencies. So if we appropriate it directly, then there would technically still be a funding shortfall from UOG because there's an obligation specifically from the agency. So it passes through the agency in order to meet that funding obligation.
I think analogy, Mr. Speaker, it's like you have to go pay your parking ticket, but then you send your mom for you instead. I'm tired. It's been a long day. I can see how this is, and this is why I'm doing this amendment, Mr. Speaker, because even though it's a responsibility on the private organization, like UOG, with multiple financing opportunities and resources to put this in, what we're doing is basically we're fronting the cash to them to place the bet for us or to put it into the account for us. And that's why I'm making and proffering this amendment. It doesn't actually take away the requirement from UOG to do their deposit. It just takes away the taxpayer liability to do it on their behalf.
And
Mr.
because, yes, go ahead.
Would this then keep the $250,000 at DOE in the TEF?
It would keep it in the TEF, not necessarily in DOE, because
All
TEF will go to different,
Thank you, Mr.
all three agencies.
Mr. Chairman, so just to be clear, then if we remove this requirement, or at least this funding, this appropriation, then, but UOG will still be required by law to put in $250,000 out of the budget, out of the reduced budget that we're giving them this year. Is that true?
They're supposed to
They're
be.
obligated to.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, UOG's budget this year is less than was this fiscal year?
Correct.
Thank you.
All those in favor of this amendment? No, there was no objection. Oh, there was an objection. All those in favor of this amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Fails.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the same argument can be had for the $200,000 that is appropriated from the Territorial Education Facilities Fund to the Guam Community College so that they can pay their obligation and their requirement to provide a deposit into the First Generation Trust Fund initiative. So the amendment is to strike that portion of that appropriation to them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any senator wish to be heard? As it relates to the GCC, on page 26. Any other senator wish to be heard? Is there an Senator Espaldon.
Just the same question, Mr. Chair. The appropriations for GCC for fiscal 19 is less than the appropriations from fiscal 2018. Is that correct?
Correct.
And they would still be liable for putting into this first generation fund, even if we do delete this section? And it would be from the reduced amount of their appropriations this year, next year?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Lee? You object? There's an objection. All those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Fails. Number 18, Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 18 is a removal. It accounts for up to $674,023, and it's a removal of direct appropriations in addition to the appropriations granted, multiple appropriations granted to the University of Guam. This one's kind of a long one, but if you go through, this is actually representative of what was proposed in Bill 237, which removed the direct appropriations for the Aquaculture Development and Training Center, WERI's Guam Hydrologic Survey, WERI's Comprehensive Water Resource Monitoring Program, the North and Southern Soil and Water Conservation Districts, KPR and KPRG Radio. Now, again, what this does is we give UOG $3,287,524 for scholarships. And now the $647,000 that we were giving them for direct appropriations for these various programs, all that's being asked is that is taken out of the appropriations given to them for both programs and training programs and scholarships that exist at UOG. And now this is a general fund appropriation of $3.2 million given to UOG.
Any senator wish to be heard on this? Senator Tom Adda.
Yeah, I think I need further clarification, because the way I read this amendment is that we are now actually reducing the amount of funds available for scholarships, because in addition to the scholarships and training programs, they must also fund out of that the aquaculture development, WERI. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yes.
And so if you were to look at it as one, I think the scholarships and training programs in many ways are interchangeable depending on the program. So if you were to get a true reflection of the scholarships, if you refer to Bill 323, you would take the 3.287 million and then you would add up the additional 6, and that puts them close to 4 million in scholarships out of the general fund, Mr. Chairman. And again, I don't it's not a bad thing, but I think it's something to be mindful of, because those are the same appropriations we have been giving them when times were good. And so this is one of the few instances, and again, these are not all one-for-one federal grant matches. This is just general fund appropriation going to a private institution, a private money-making institution. And based on that justification, there are so many agencies that we have that are hurting that have no way of generating revenue. No way of generating revenue. Department of Education can't go raise money. And so the idea here is not to subvert education, it's to reprioritize the resources we have available, and the resources we have that's limited is general fund.
But then, if you're removing those direct appropriations, is there any reason why you maintained in there the direct appropriation to Guampedia?
Yes, Senator, that's because they're appropriated with Tourist Attraction Fund. And so I didn't touch that, and I believe based on a previous version of the bill, there was a federal grant match to that. But again, I only focused on the general fund appropriation because it had the most liquidity to be able to address other areas of the government that were falling short.
All right, thank you.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to be very crystal clear of what this amendment will do, right now, under the way the bill is drafted, we've appropriated $3.2 million strictly for student scholarships, financial assistance programs, and for the administration of those programs. That $3.2 million was just limited to, in the bill, merit awards for all of our merit scholars, student loans, the nursing training program, the SUS Taurus Professional and Technical Awards, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, Regent Scholarships, Marine Lab Graduate Assistance Programs, Early High School Admission Programs, the Pedro Doc Sanchez Scholarship, and the administration of all student financial assistance programs for the fiscal year. It also goes on to say that no more than 10% of that total $3.2 million shall be used for the administration of the programs, which means that roughly $2.9 million was going to specifically go to the students to pay for their costs through these various programs as scholarships. With this amendment, what we would do is we would take the subsequent sections 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and lump them into that single appropriation. So what would happen is we would definitely be basically deappropriating from the scholarships and reappropriating to these other programs that have direct appropriations. I'm not comfortable with that, Mr. Chairman. I know that we're trying to find places to cut, and I'm totally on board with that. I've been participating since the morning. But we need to be careful also that we don't cross the line into what is draconian. And these scholarship programs, they're definitely not icing on the cake. They've gone to fund the education of many of our people who are working in the public and private sector here on Guam, and at least contributing to the public and private sector here on Guam, and either directly or indirectly through their employment after they've achieved these their degrees through the help of these programs. You know, we're talking about our merit scholars, the students who earn that by finishing within a certain number of the top 10 in their high schools. They earned it. The student loans, the nursing training program. These are all programs that are very critical to high need areas on our island, and I'm down for cutting, but I just don't. I'm also, you know, when you cut it at the risk of cutting into investment that's actually having a long-term benefit for our island, that causes me to pause. So I do object to this particular amendment. I think that if we wanted to carve out the projected $674,000 in savings, we can do that in other areas. We don't need to be taking it from the scholarships of the kids. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee. After Senator Lee, any other senator wish to be heard on this amendment?
Suzus Masi, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to just thank my colleagues for their participation in today's session. I know it's been grueling and it's difficult to think about realizing these cuts and also to kind of balance that with the revenue generation ideas that this body has put forward. I want to thank the mover of this amendment, but I agree with the retiring speaker that when you talk about sharing this $3,287,524 that was previously, or that we continue to allot for scholarships and training programs, this is an opportunity for us to provide access to our students. It opens the door for many opportunities that they have, and the return on investment for this $3 million is tremendous. The previous speaker had mentioned merit awards, student loans, the nursing training program. That is something so critical on our island right now. We are struggling with not being able to have enough healthcare professionals, and especially local healthcare professionals. That's very critical. One thing that I wanted to add also is we're kind of bundling all of these other training centers to include the Aquaculture Development and Training Center, WERI's Guam Hydrologic Survey, the Comprehensive Water Resource Monitoring Program, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and KPRG, all of which serve incredibly critical services. I mean, they're really vital to a lot of the things we do here. And when we talk about some of the development that we've considered in this body, the creation of new power plants and how that might affect our island's aquifer, many individuals from WERI have testified and have given incredible amounts of data and research from this comprehensive water resource monitoring program. And it's extremely imperative that we maintain WERI and keep them funded. And so I just, I oppose this amendment. I think a lot of primarily to ensure that our students have access to the University of Guam and all their training programs, but really because I think that it provides a tremendous return on this $3.2 million investment. Stuas Masi.
Thank you. Any other senator? If not, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would like the record to reflect, what you see here in terms of what I'm taking away is just a juxtapose and a rewrite and an application of how we were funding Department of Education in Bill 237, which was publicly heard. I didn't hear any issues when it was publicly heard and potentially going to be the budget we were addressing today. And that was, I think, was a very bare bones look. And I don't think we're ever going to know. But I want to go back to what I was saying before. These are great programs. I don't have anything against them. But you've heard the testimony. Our public school kids are not doing well to get into college. They might never see these programs. And so I think our priority, considering the fiscal situation, considering the decrease in resources, the finite resources we have available, especially in general fund, that why put all of this money into college if we're not investing enough into our public school systems for the kids to even be prepared to get into college? Did you know, if you look at this, add all the numbers for UOG, they're getting way more than the hospital's ever gotten. Even up to now, we're finally fully funding the hospital. But guess what? UOG's been getting an over $30, $33, $34, $36 million in total appropriation year after year. A private institution that could turn people away because you can't pass the test. And these are the types of priorities that we've been looking at our government with. No, don't touch UOG, even though they can make money. Oh, I'm sorry. Can't come to this school. You don't quite cut it. While we have some Department of Education can't turn anybody away. And I was just interested to see, this what came from 237, and I wanted to see what these cuts look like. They might not seem like much. Of course, it's an investment going to UOG. But what would it look like if we were to put it back into Department of Education, which has been cut big time? And again, I think my colleagues make some very, very good points. I would just like to see at least the opportunity to see some change, because education, I think, is important. But, to think UOG is more important, Department of Education, or more, and I'm not saying anybody's saying that, but the way we fund it, the way we're prioritizing it and are funding it, is doing all the talking for us. A scholarship for one kid versus more teachers. Books, research material that might serve hundreds over a long period of time. I think, Mr. Chairman, it's gonna come to a point even further that we have to really even sit down and really hash out what our priorities are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. On this amendment, all those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Senator Estevez, 19.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment 19, line 1, page 88, is an amendment to strike item BB, which is striking the Guam Educational Telecommunications Corporation, or what everyone knows as PBS, in its entirety. Again, I know it's not popular, but we have to really start looking at cost-benefit analysis as we move forward. We're either in a fiscal crisis or not. I'm not saying they don't provide a service, but what you're seeing here with regards to just payroll alone is around little over $450,000 a year in liability, payroll liability, which is only going to increase. And in 2018, when everything is digital and many people have internet available to them with so much free content, so much educational content, I think we can start looking at other models. And I think in doing and passing an amendment like this and finding the savings, I think provides an opportunity to recreate PBS. I'm not saying it disappears, but maybe recreate them within Office of Technology with the focus on digital media. Or maybe they could go back to their roots as a nonprofit organization. But when we consider our spending habits and how a nonprofit organization that was able to get federal grants, that were able to do all these things, somehow transformed into an entity with like 8 or 10 classified employees. And I'm not saying they don't provide a service. But is this what the taxpayer wants right now? And is this what we're going to put on the taxpayer for the next 60, 70 years? Until they decide to retire, and once they retire, paying their retiree medical and COLA, that liability does not go away. But we do know that the return is not there anymore. And so again, I think we need to look at personnel for the long term and how our grandkids are going to be paying for that. Thank you, Madam Chair. I know this is going to be a tough one. I stand ready and I'm interested for the comments.
Thank you
Thank
very
you, Senator Estevez. Speaker Cruz.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I had to relinquish the chair to come and speak on this one. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm so old that I remember when PBS was the only channel that we could pick up before cable. And KGTF was the only way that people who didn't have daycare could expose their children to some of the educational programs on that channel. I know all of us may have digital ability currently, have internet at home, but I think we'd be surprised how many thousands of families out there don't have internet. That's the reason why children are having to go to the library to hook onto the internet, or are actually sitting in the lobbies of hotels and coffee shops to get their internet. But for the young children that aren't even school age, this is the only exposure that they have to some kind of learning experience, because mom and dad can't afford daycare and Montessori and whatever other. I could go on, but I really beg this body. This amount of $500,000 is is a great investment on the part of this community to provide the young children in this community with the exposure to these educational programs that don't have iPads. I know that there are lots of children out there that walk around with their own iPads, but there are so many other families that don't have it. And we cannot, this is one channel that you can get without having even cable. And so I ask my colleagues, please, let's protect this for the children. I mean, and for those of us old people, I mean, it provides probably the most balanced news stories for anything. It really, you just, from the other day when the Emmys came out, PBS got most of the Emmy Awards for documentary and news coverage. Their documentaries are phenomenal. And being an old person without much to do in the evening, I avail myself of all the documentaries that come on, and it's phenomenal, the things that you can possibly learn on PBS. Yes, having cable, I might be able to get to Discovery and to National Geographic Channel, but if you don't have cable and you only have PBS, this is the only place that you're going to be able to get this kind of exposure. So I ask us to please protect PBS. Thank you.
Situs Masi, Mr. Speaker. Senator Muña and then Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I haven't said much, maybe more than 10 words all day today. But when this measure came up, there's so many things that I just want to say. And I actually, I really do have to respect the mover of this amendment for putting his neck out on the line, because even knowing that he was probably going to be choked at it. But like the speaker said, there's a lot of things that we want to stand up for, all these different measures that he has put forth on this body. And, you know, I think it's been proven who we want to stand up for and who we want to stick it to through the majority votes of all of the measures that we've gone down the line already. And putting the kids on the line, I think that's probably a little bit too straightforward. And like the speaker said, all of us grew up on PBS. And I think throughout the years, most of us have supported and maybe even contributed to keeping PBS alive. And just because we're going through a financial crisis doesn't mean that we should kill it at this point, because we've struggled to keep it alive. And I think we should continue to do that. So more than 10 words, that's my more than 10 words, and I just want to say that I strongly oppose this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I remember the PBS channel, Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street. Was one of my favorite shows growing up. And you know, it does provide, just as the speaker, the retiring speaker has said, educational content to a lot of our people, to a lot of our kids. And you know, although I do agree that there needs to be some more thought put into the operations, without a plan in place to just defund it and wipe it out, I don't think would do anyone any justice. You know, I believe that perhaps next year, when someone else is in Adelup, can have that plan in place to ensure that the services that is provided to our kids is continued. So I join the speakers in objecting to this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator St. Nicholas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I share the same sentimentalities as some of the retiring speakers. I remember the TVs when they only had 13 buttons on them, and I remember having to push the search function. It wasn't even a search function. It was like something to try and pick up the signal, and then you'll just until you hit it, you know. And then I remember watching. As a retiring speaker said, of Mr. Rogers, and waiting. My favorite part was always when Trolley would come out and then when he would go back in again. And I would always wonder when I was little, I would wonder where does he go, you know? But there's just a whole bunch of sentimentalities. But one of the things I wanted to speak to is the actual function of the PBS, and the fact that we're not just talking about paying for an operation, but we're also talking about paying for something that fills a critical role, and perhaps may prove its worth in the most unexpected of circumstances. We're talking about an operation that can reach out to the entire community and broadcast emergency information. People can be directed to tune in to the channel and be able to receive updates if it comes down to that. If we have any kind of communications problems that all of a sudden we have to go back to the old school rudimentary stuff, we have this to fall back on. And the cost associated with keeping this agency running also prevents us from having to mothball the entire asset. And, you know, we've all seen those really cool movies where, you know, those doomsday scenarios, things get wiped out, and all of a sudden it's the really old school technologies that keep us going. You know, I don't wish that on any of us, but this is one of those very relatively low-cost areas that could prove to be the most invaluable resource in the most desperate of times. And we may not want to shutter the operation because of our circumstances now, when an operation like this could prove to be extremely valuable when our circumstances are perhaps even worse than they are today. And just to put into perspective further, Madam Chair, we're talking about a $569,000 savings. If we have to go back up to the top of the list and work our way back down to figure out where we can pull that $569,000 in order to continue this operation, that's an option that we should reconsider versus mothballing Guam PBS in its entirety. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. On the amendment, Senator Lee, you are recognized.
This is Masi, Madam Speaker. I also wanted to stand in opposition to this amendment. One of the, I agree with many of the things that the retiring speakers have said. I myself and my children really love Sesame Street and Clifford the Big Red Dog and, you know, all of the different characters from PBS. So much so that our family has purchased a membership. And so I just wanted to make mention of that. It's my understanding that while the government gives this $500,000 subsidy for PBS, they also have, you know, tens of thousands of dollars coming in membership fees. So that's one of the ways that they kind of balance out how much money they're spending for the invaluable resource that they provide to the community. And so I just wanted to make mention of that. And I think that the initial speaker in opposition to this amendment is just right on point. I think that there are a lot of members of our community that don't have access to a lot of educational programming. They're unable to afford cable, and a lot of these resources are available at our public libraries and things like that, but it really gives these parents an opportunity to turn on the TV and give their children this exposure at a very young age, and that's really important for both the children and their parents. So for that reason, and just in support of our families and in support of PBS, I stand in opposition to this amendment. Sijus Masi.
Sijus Masi. Senator Uggan, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Speaker. You know, I've listened very intently to a number of the statements a little earlier, and it brings back a lot of memories. When I was a little kid, the only other option, one of two options, is either turn on the TV and access, because they were the prevalent show at that time, either KOAM or KGTF. You know, and there's something that the mover of the amendment had alluded to a little earlier in part of his presentation. And I commend him for looking for ways in which we can reduce the overall obligation of the general fund. But perhaps we should explore the possibility of consolidating KGTF, the Guam Educational Telecommunications Corporation, with other entities within the government of Guam. And I bring that up because the previous statements by former speakers is absolutely on point. This is one option that is available to our children out there who don't have access to cable, who don't have access to internet. They can tune in and get access to PBS and KGTF. So, Madam Speaker, I'd like to move that to amend the amendment, then that rather than deleting the appropriation altogether, that the appropriation be reduced by the amount of $69,814. And that would be reflective, Madam Speaker, of making sure that not only does this entity contribute towards the reduction of expenditures of this government, but it seriously looks at, and the entire government looks at ways in which we can consolidate, we can streamline, and we can share resources within this government. Because if you look at consolidating KGTF with another entity, it could be complementary in nature in terms of the services that they provide or the function that they provide, you would automatically realize the pooling of resources and the sharing of equipment and vehicles and other assets, and perhaps even foregoing the lease of a particular facility or a particular equipment. That's where the streamlining and that's where the efficiencies would be realized. So, Madam Speaker, rather than looking at deleting the entire amount, I would like to proffer that the section remain intact and that the $569,814 figure be reduced by $69,814 based on the points that I've shared. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Sister Tomasi, Senator Uggan, Senator Torres on the Uggan amendment.
The question that I have for the proffer of that amendment is, in looking at the funding source for this particular section for Guam Educational Telecommunications, it comes from the TEFF. So if the objective, I believe, of the overall amendments is to reduce the general fund balance, then that amendment is really so nominal. It doesn't have the effect of what we're trying to accomplish here by reducing the general fund cuts, which I thought was the main objective of this whole exercise. So I don't think that it really accomplishes much, and I don't see the value in that proposition, or in general in this whole amendment to begin with.
Just a point of personal privilege,
Yes, Senator.
Madam Speaker, and in direct response to the previous senator, you know, there was an allocation, or there's a proposal to reallocate some of the TAF based on the hotel occupancy tax that was adopted yesterday towards some of the critical agencies in this government. That is not directly related to general fund. So that's why in this particular case, it's either we look at reducing costs and expenditures of this government of Guam, and in some instances, reallocating it elsewhere so that it can be applied in other critical areas. So just in response to that particular statement, because she's right, the initial intent of many of these amendments was general fund focused, but we also have to look at the entire government of Guam and the limited resources that we have, general fund or special funds. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Just to remind the body, there's been an amendment made by Senator Uggan to restore item BB and to just reduce the amount of the appropriation by $69,814. So the total would now be $500,000 appropriated from the TEFF to the Guam Education Telecommunications Corporation, PBS Guam. Senator Muña on the amendment.
I'm just wondering if this needs a public hearing, this particular amendment. I'm not sure.
I would rule, as a chair, I'd rule no, that it does not require an additional public hearing, but I leave it to the body if you'd like to overrule the chair. Would any other member wish to be heard on the amendment by Senator Uggan? Senator St. Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question. The 69,000 figure, where is that? What is that? The basis of the 69,000?
Senator Uggan, do you yield?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and to the good senator asked the question. I was looking at, if you listen to my initial presentation, it's looking at continuing the services and the function that KGTF is providing, PBS is providing, but also encouraging the streamlining and the consolidation of this entity with other entities within the government of Guam, so that there can be pooling of resources. So that's where it's 69,000. I looked at the personnel object categories, 464,000, and then I just chose a $500,000 allocation.
Senator St. Nicholas.
I'm just curious because I'm trying to figure out why that specific dollar figure. Is that a specific position that's being targeted to reduce the cost, or I'm just curious as to the exact nature of the number. Because the same objective could be fulfilled either way. We could we could reduce the budget by half or by 2/3. I'm just curious as to that was a point of inquiry, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Speaker Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Madam Chair, as you can see from there, the personnel cost is 464. To leave the appropriation just at 500,000 would only give them $36,000 for operations. There are other things that they have. They have their membership to National PBS that they have to pay for. They have that facility up at Barragata Heights that they've got to maintain. This was bare bones. I'd have to object to reducing this amount. So I object to the amendment.
There's been an objection to the Uggan amendment. Would any other member wish to be heard on it? If not, we'll call for the question.
Madam Chair. Yeah,
Madam Vice Speaker, you're recognized.
Just wanted to check with OFB because it was my understanding that this agency there was an executive order that consolidated several agencies under the Department of Chamorro Affairs. This was one of them. So for several years, it didn't have a director, but I think recently it has a director, right? So that position's been filled, and I guess I'm just curious if that was funded in the amount in the substitute bill. That position continued to be funded.
Yes, in the total 464.9 thousand, approximately salaries and benefits for a general manager. The position title would be the equivalent of the director for that agency. It was funded in that 464,000.
All right. Do they pay anything for the studio next to GCC?
The only additional on top of the 464,000 that is funded in the budget is the 29,000 for the PBS membership, and then 75,000 for power. There's nothing included in here for any supplies, equipment, or rent.
So what is their obligation for a Barragata facility?
I don't believe they have any rent that they pay for that
All
facility.
right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker. Anyone else on the Uggan amendment? There's been an objection. All in favor of the Uggan amendment to restore the language but reduce the appropriation to $500,000 for PBS Guam? All in favor? Amendment fails. On the Estefy's amendment, any other member wish to be heard? If not, there's been an objection to the Estefy's amendment. All in favor? Oh, sorry. Senator Estevez, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I knew bringing this up would be Oscar the Grouch here. I think it's been like that all day. But, you know, again, it's really, I think, to highlight that there are so many priorities here, little nooks and crannies in government that I think many in the public would agree is important. Many might not agree is important. And I think when I put it kind of on the litmus test, you know, on the sheet, to start kind of driving the budget forward and how we're thinking and seeing where we're at and how we're going to be approaching this, you know, that's why I think there was a focus on DOE. You know, Guam PBS is an educational program. Guam Department of Education is an educational institution. You know, how do you compare them side by side? Same with the university. I think there are many opportunities that we can bring Guam PBS into the future. That doesn't necessarily involve more funding. I think consolidation with other organizations or entities, whether it's even maybe the radio station we just decided to keep funding over at UOG, maybe we can put them together. But I think to some of the points and creative ideas that came out was really the intent of removing the appropriation, because it's not the money that's the big deal. You know, I think we all identify it's not that much. But I think the idea of having PBS is important, and it probably, I think, would have continued to live, whether as a non-profit entity outside generating its own revenue, no longer a liability of the government, or under another agency that can serve other purposes. But I think Office of Technology would have been a great one with more digital content and other opportunities. So, you know, again, I just proposing the amendment. I know it's not a lot of money, but considering the overall situation, I think it would have been a benefit. I just want, you know, so you know, part of the research was looking at the staffing patterns over a period of time. There's not really that much funding available. I think their last federal grant they might have had was in 2017, and it's been, or 2016 possibly, and it's been a bit silent. And, you know, things that we have to consider is the facility up there. It's $75,000 a year on power. It's pretty much more than any production funding they have available, at least organically within the budget. And then you see a large whopping $400,000+. And again, this is like one of those things we need to look at, where if almost all of the money goes to payroll, are they able to develop the programs that they could be developing? Are they able to do it if we were to take away one employee and convert that to operational expenses? Or are we always forced to just have to give more, have to give more, have to give more? I think that's the question that is always burning, at least it's always burning with me. What can we do with less? And do we really know, or have we really tried? So again, without beating a dead horse, thank my colleagues for the input. It was great to hear all the childhood stories. I too did watch Mr. Rogers. I couldn't tell you if it was on PBS. I tell you, I always wanted to get into the little train thing and kind of play around and have an adventure, but it never happened for me. Yeah, so, you know, I'll be the honorary Oscar the Grouch and continue forward with the amendment and call the question.
Thank you, Senator. On the Estevez amendment on page, yes, Senator
Point of
Nelson.
order, Madam Chair. It wasn't clear if that was his closing remarks, but I do want to comment on the amendment before the vote. Yes?
You're recognized.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd like to thank Senator Estevez for his amendment. I want to point out to my colleagues that I made it very clear earlier while we were working on the GFD amendment that GFD is underfunded for their 45 recruits that was not in the current staffing pattern that OFB looked at in January. They need $2 million to continue to fund these recruits that are already in current funded positions. Now, I want to point out that in Public Law 34-42, actually, let me go to the RFP. the fiscal realignment plan in 2018 that we had to adjust the budget earlier this year.
Sorry, Senator, would it be possible to just dispense with this
It's very
amendment, or
much in
it's-
relation to what
okay.
we're discussing. It's $36.39 million. Now, with the spreadsheet that was given to us, GFD is only going to receive $30 million. So they are short $2 million to fund the 45 recruits that are already currently hired and in the job position and title. Now, during austere moments in our government, streamlining the government, we discuss about the 3 pillars that we want to focus on, even during the campaign trail: public safety, education, and health. Now, I don't know how far education goes, but this public broadcasting service should be used for the 3 pillars: public safety, education, and health. And I'm asking my colleagues for their support in that if we can take this money and put it into correct the misappropriation that was overlooked during the preparation of this bill to help fund the 45 recruits that have already been hired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Estevez, you've... Okay. Yes, so on the... No, it's just a point of information.
Oh, I see.
On the Estevez amendment, on page 88, to strike item BB, there's been an objection. All in favor of the Estevez amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment fails. Senator Estevez, you're recognized.
If I know, are we? Do you want to? We'll continue. I think we're almost done, Mr. Chair. Number 20 is just a straight up general fund reduction of the University of Guam to the tune of $1,017,246. And now these amounts, they're not based on anything. I think it was to cover the difference. So if everything were to pass, if we were to vote on everything today, that would have made up the 23 million that we would have been short. And would have gone right back to Department of Education. But I wanted to end with the University of Guam and Guam Community College again to highlight, I think, the fact of how I believe we're over prioritizing higher education, and we've really lacked focus, I think, on the foundation of education, and it's showing. It's showing. All the data is showing it. So I'm pushing this amendment to see if we can take a portion of that funding from a private institution capable of funding itself and giving that to Department of Education, which is incapable of funding itself. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. On the amendment, Senator Sinicolas. After Senator Sinicolas, anybody else wish to speak?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that I always try to stay mindful of when I evaluate government agencies and how they're performing and whether or not we can squeeze a little more from them and get more, either generate more savings or have more productivity. One of the things I always try and bear in mind is, are we talking about an operation that is a success story with the resources that it's allocated, or is it something that's a constant disappointment or a nightmare even? And while comparisons can be made as to how much is appropriated to various agencies, I'm incredibly proud of the ability of the University of Guam to be able to take the resources that this government has been allocating it and produce what it has been producing over the years. It's one of those situations where everything's pretty much going right thus far. I remember when I was in school there, it feels like not too long ago, but I think it's starting to become a little while ago. There was accreditation issues. There were issues with governance, and there were issues with making sure that certain things are being done in order to keep the accreditation of the school. Fast forward to today, and we're no longer having those conversations. The university is expanding into other schools, and it's also become almost a rallying point for a lot of activism here on this island, and for raising more awareness to a lot of our cultural and historical issues, our grievances that have gone unresolved. It's starting to almost become, and I think it started a while ago, but it's definitely flourishing into the kind of entity that a university is supposed to be, the kind that is nurturing and cultivating these seeds that kind of just burst out and saturate into the community. And I think that that's something that we need to continue to invest in. When I was going to school and even in the immediate years thereafter up at UOG, I would always look back and say, man, I wish this university would have more involvement in our community. I wish that it would be a bigger player in shaping the direction of this island and in the minds and hearts of our people. Because when I was going there, it was just kind of focusing on its own closed self. But that's changed a great deal. It's changed a great deal, and it's done so due in part to our ability to continue to invest what we can in the institution. And the institution itself comes back to us and says, we want you to invest a little bit more, and we still, given our realities, struggle to invest what we can. This amount that we have here is a representation of what is an investment that we can make. And again, similar to what I stated earlier with respect to making cuts to the point where it's actually draconian and it begins to have a negative impact into our community, those statements with respect to scholarships in particular definitely apply to the university in general. If we begin to scale back the appropriations to the university that they are anticipating, and if we were to drop them by an additional $1 million that's being proposed here, this is one of those situations where we don't want to try and cut into the fat so much that we're slicing into the meat. And that's just what I wanted to talk about with respect to this. The university is on the right track. It's doing a lot of the things that I've only dreamed it would do. And I want that to continue to flourish. And if that means that we need to figure out cuts elsewhere, or if we need to figure out revenue, then that's something that we have to do. But I don't want to cut the university or the Guam Community College or the Department of Education in lieu of the fact that we weren't able to collect from entities that aren't paying their taxes. Because really that's the trade-off here. Are we going to cut education because we're not going out and collecting what we're supposed to? So that being said, Mr. Chairman, I would need to object to this particular amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other senator? Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd have to oppose this amendment because this amendment contradicts exactly what I spoke on earlier. Our three priorities should be public safety, health, and education. So I don't know how far down the PBS services and Mr. Big Bird is important before firefighters, but I'd have to respectfully oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other senator wish to be heard? Madam Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, how does the amount that was put into the substitute bill compare to what they've been given this fiscal year? Not, I know that some of their appropriations have been withheld by Department of Administration. Yeah.
I'm not sure how much they received to date, but in the past, we've appropriated as much as 34 to them. And though they might not have received it during the fiscal year, we've allowed them to receive it after the fiscal year ended. And so they've assured me that they've been made whole by January or February of the next fiscal year, and then short again that year. But we've been up to 34, and this time they actually even asked for 36. But
So what have they been operating, what have they been operating up until July? It must be less than 34?
yeah, let me, hold on a sec, we'll just check. Just 1 minute, we'll try to get. According to the CRER, for the end of June, not the end of July yesterday, but the end of June, it was 20.
They've received 20, all right, and you were going to appropriate 27 on the original substitute bill? I'm trying to find, I don't have my FRP right in front of me, but the FY18 appropriation before the FRP looks like 34? Yeah,
Correct.
that's the 34, okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess, so he said straight off that there are no details to where this cut would be made, this proposed cut. I guess that's my issue. I mean, I don't see any sacred cows that every agency, every branch, every, thing should be looked at. But yeah, I just like to see the details before we make this $1 million cut. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any senator wish to be heard on this? Any senator wish to be heard on this? If not, you may close, Senator. There's been an objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, again, to highlight, I think we put a lot of stock into supporting education, and I think this is an opportunity to show where our priorities are with regards to education. I think the university has done really well. They always impress. And if you look at their budget is, again, if you compare it to GMH, they've been funded well for a while. And I'm not trying to use this to poke and say, all the issues are funding related, but I think it sheds some light to how we look at priorities moving forward in the government and how we fund things. Because a story about having issues with accreditation is funding issues over a period of time, and how I think with the right leadership and with the right funding that you can really turn something around. So I think there's so many of agencies out there that have funding issues, some more dependent than others, and I really wanted to highlight, I think going forward, that the Department of Education is one such agency that I agree, it might not be entirely funding, or in some cases, it truly might be funding. And I think in the case that we can see with the University of Guam, I think when good, earnest funding was provided, and giving them the tools and the best chance of success, you'll see success that will last. But I think what we need to start establishing now is that as a private university, having been treated like the firstborn, the best educated, best groomed, best set up for success, at what point where will we start to slow some of the help and the subsidies and the paid rent? And when are we going to start letting the private university fly on its own a bit? I mean, I think those are the details moving forward we need to look at. I mean, we still have, I think this is the last year, but we still have University of Guam bond debt on our books. And again, when we're talking about priorities in a difficult situation, Department of Education can't turn students away, and GMH cannot turn patients away. So thank you for my colleagues for their input. We're almost through this, and I'd just like to call the question.
Thank you. There's been an objection to the Estefy amendment as it relates to the university's funding. All those in favor of the Estefy amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Your last amendment, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two quick housekeeping ones. One was recommended by OFB, and I'd like to just go ahead and introduce that, if that's all right with the body. If not, I can wait.
Let's take this last one
All right.
in order, and then so we.
The last amendment, Amendment 21, Mr. Speaker, is to lower the appropriation of the Guam Community College by $735,613, with the intention to prioritize that funding to Guam Department of Education. The new appropriation level would be $15,414,357. The justifications and the information I put out with regards to prioritizing public school systems right now with regards to funding to best provide opportunities for those individuals to get into colleges and be able to attend these universities that we subsidize. I think the same logic can apply to the Guam Community College. Thank you.
Thank you. On the amendment, anyone wish to be heard? Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been through a number of budgets for the government, I can say with absolute certainty that it is the Guam Community College that has always approached the budget, I think, in the most responsible fashion. They would always present their budgets, and if I recall, there may have been a fiscal year or two where they didn't even ask for more money. That's unheard of. And if we could have more of that in this government, I think that would be truly amazing. As a matter of fact, I remember multiple conversations of President Okada where she would even encourage us to support the college, because she has various initiatives where she's able to turn $1 into $3. If we're able to put in just $100,000 into this one program, I can get $300,000 to back it, or something to that effect, similar ratios. It's a very well-managed operation. It's been the poster child for responsible budgeting, and it has been the least impacting on our budget on a year-over-year basis, as far as I can recall. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Chairman. I think there was even one year where they asked for a reduction. They were, I think, the only agency that came to us and said, we can do it for a little bit less this year. And that's because of some of the investments that they've made. Solar power and etc. So again, Mr. Chairman, this is one of those agencies that they've done so well, very well managed. They're using their resources the right way. Granted, the whole point of this exercise is to be able to find cuts that we can move money into other areas, but they're also runs the risk of us degrading the value of the dollar, where by squeezing out 700,000 in savings from GCC, we're losing out on the returns that they would have been able to generate from that 700,000, and on top of that, by putting that money into another organization that isn't as well managed, we're losing the buying power of that original 700,000. So what would have been a $700,000 savings could turn into a multi-million-dollar loss at the end of the day. Those are just things that we need to be very mindful of. So with respect to the Guam Community College, given their excellent track record, given their proven budgetary discipline and their ability to take resources and compound their value rather than degrade their value, I would have to object also to this, this particular amendment and focus on finding the revenue from another source or realizing the savings from another place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other Senator Munya?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too feel the exact same way as the previous speaker, that of all of the agencies that have come through the budget hearings, they're the ones who are the most responsible, and I do remember the look on your face when they asked for less, and you were very happy with that. So reducing their budget even more is almost like spanking them when they're being good, and I don't think that that's a good idea. So I oppose this this amendment too as well, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? If not, you may close, Senator.
I just want to thank my colleagues for entertaining the amendments. You know, there are some that I thought were really good and viable, and I'm glad to have gotten input from the body as to whether or not we were going to move forward with them. There were some that I wasn't so sure of, but I'm glad that it got presented, and I hope that moving forward, I think we got a better grasp of some areas that we're just not interested in touching, or we would like to go into more detail, and I think that's going to be a benefit in moving forward with the budget. So I'd like to thank my colleagues and you know, I don't expect a vote on this one, but I still humbly ask it, and so I'm calling for the question, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. There's been an objection. All those in favor of this Estefy amendment as it relates to GCC, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Thank you, Senator. And there are a few that have been tabled that you're going to discuss with the colleagues on how you want to work between yourselves. I purposely set this day aside because yesterday we kept saying that why are we working on increases when we really should be cutting? So are there any other senators with amendments to introduce as it relates to any cuts that you believe that we should take? Senator Argan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do have an amendment that I'm going to have to coordinate with the clerk's office to have printed. But it comes back again to the big elephant, no pun intended, in the room. My question to you, Mr. Chair, is looking and understanding the process without sharing any information that needs to be withheld. The health insurance policy, is that an area where we can realize savings and cap the contribution on the part of the government of Guam so that in fact it can be allocated in other areas?
We can probably address that. I'm going to need to get with Department of Administration because I don't want to violate my non-disclosure agreement. But do you have specifically any amendments that you wish to make? Because if not, tomorrow we have to break by noon because our good operations staff is going to have to break down the legislature and have it ready for the tomorrow evening. So we only have 4 hours tomorrow morning on which to work on things. Are there any cuts that you wish to make? Otherwise, tomorrow I'd like to devote the day so that I stop hearing that we're not getting things. We'll invite Mr. Burns down. You can ask him the question.
Okay.
Joe can invite Reverend Tax so that she can finally get her questions answered. And are there any other questions that need to be taken care of so that we can take some boogeymen off the table? Just
A couple of things, Mr. Speaker, and I know I brought this up a little earlier, and it's all subject to approach. I recommended that the two provisions towards the end of this particular proposal that would identify resources to go to GMH and resources to go to address the initial work on the reconstruction of Simon Sanchez High School, that particular, those individualized pieces of legislation be addressed separate from the budget. And we all know that there have been instances in the past where allocation or authorization was provided and then all of a sudden the funding is not there. And that's why with the advent of August 6th, which is the deadline for all these taxpayers who entered into the amnesty program to be able to remit the balance of their obligation, now is the opportune time to be able to deal with those two separate pieces of legislation that I am recommending be acted upon and sent to the governor ASAP. The other aspect is, if you can give me a 1-minute recess, I do have an amendment that I'd like to forward to the clerks to print, please.
I could. I understand what you're saying about severing those last two. Since they already had a public hearing, we could. I just need to try to figure out. Let me think about it. You want a short recess?
Yes, please, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Egan,
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of amendments, and the first one has already been circulated, and it's in reference to exemption to the increase in the hotel occupancy tax. It would read, the increase in the hotel occupancy tax as set forth in Section 2 of this act shall not apply to the following contracts. Contracts entered into or awarded prior to the enactment of this act, which were based upon bid awards made prior to the passage of this act that cannot be amended or renegotiated to accommodate the increase in the hotel occupancy tax. And sub-item 2, contracts entered into or awarded after enactment of this act, which were based upon bids or proposals submitted prior to enactment of this act that cannot be amended or renegotiated to accommodate the increase in the hotel occupancy tax. For purposes of this section, each hotel claiming an exemption under this section shall provide the Guam Department of Revenue and Taxation with a copy of its bid contract or award under which any claimed exemption is being made. The Director of the Department of Revenue and Taxation shall create an affidavit form to be completed and submitted concurrently with the filing of the hotel's tax exemption. Said affidavit shall request from the filing hotel all relevant information necessary to properly execute the law as provided in this act. Mr. Speaker and Senators, colleagues, this is one of the issues that was brought up during the course of the public hearing in the initial legislation that would adjust the hotel occupancy tax, that there are already existing contracts with hotels and some of their partners, their stakeholders, in terms of bringing visitors to Guam, and that it would pose a significant increase in costs that would have to be absorbed internally. And I ask you for your consideration. Thank you very much. If in fact this provision was not, it would have to be absorbed internally if this provision was not at least given an allowance during the duration of the term of their existing contract. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
any senator wish to be heard? Senator Nelson, then Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, what kind of contract? A question for the proffer of the amendment. What kind of contract is he? Says contracts entered into or awarded. What type of contract?
Yield.
Thank you very much, Senator. Mr. Speaker, in this particular case, it would apply to contracts with regards to the occupancy of the rooms. Some of the rooms are sold, either pre-sold, and there are particular arrangements that are established, that have been established and in effect for several months now, and has a few more months until the conclusion of that particular contract. And what the increase in the hotel occupancy tax would, in this case, if the contractual terms and amounts are not able to be renegotiated, then it would directly impact the operations of that particular business and businesses and hotels. So it's existing contracts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little bit perplexed about this amendment, but I'd like to reserve my time for later in order to really digest the intent of this amendment.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's several items of the amendment that are of concern. The first is the Section A, the way it reads. The increase in the hotel occupancy tax as set forth in Section 2 of this Act shall not apply to the following contracts. The hotel occupancy tax does not apply to contracts. So the entire amendment would need to be rewritten in that perhaps the following contracts shall be deducted from assessed hotel occupancy taxes. I don't know. I did not conceptualize the amendment, but I am saying that the way that first section is drafted, it already creates an applicability problem because the hotel occupancy tax does not apply to contracts. So creating an exemption for contracts it doesn't achieve, I don't think it would achieve anything the way that it's written now. My second concern is if we were to adjust the language to somehow create a deduction for contracts that meet this threshold, that puts us into a different challenging scenario in that the whole point of us entertaining this increase to begin with was to be able to have a revenue number that we could work with in trying to get this budget to balance. By creating this exemption, we will no longer know what that revenue number is going to be. It will be very challenging because these exemptions don't just speak to contracts that were awarded prior to enactment, but it's also for contracts that were awarded after enactment that were still in the bid process or where bids are being proposed or submitted. So those aren't even reconciled. If we pass this amendment, not only would it be inapplicable as written, but if we were to amend the structure and make it apply, it would render the hotel occupancy tax increase as a funding source entirely unreliable. And well, that's just, I wanted to put that on the record that that's where we would be if we entertained this amendment at this time. And then, of course, the previous speaker did raise a good point about what contracts are we referring to, because, you know, we would be of the mind that perhaps we're talking about capital improvement contracts, but really also a pre-sale of a room is a contract. It's a contract between the company and the individual who bought the pre-sale. And so that could definitely be argued that those pre-sold rooms are under contract, and then exempt all those rooms from the tax. So there's a lot of, this creates a lot of variables in what was previously intended to be a very clean revenue generating exercise, and entertaining this amendment, I think it would basically render the hotel occupancy tax as the recent increase that we've passed as an unreliable funding source to the point where we wouldn't be able to move the budget forward based on any of those numbers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Nicholas. Senator Espaldon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't think this is necessary because we can't, under the contracts clause of the Constitution, we can't pass a law that would affect existing contracts anyway. So by operation of law, right, those rooms that have already been negotiated are exempt from the increase that we had passed yesterday. So this may be totally unnecessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? If not, you may close, Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to our colleagues, thank you for sharing your perspective as it applies to this particular situation. You know, when we talk about pre-existing contracts in terms of room sales, and then you look at the interpretation of the usage and the application of the hotel occupancy tax per room usage, it has been shared with me that the interpretation could be that any rooms that are sold or that are utilized subject to or subsequent to the passage of this budget bill would fall into this category. And that's why a business individual had approached my office and asked for consideration if this body would consider it, because it was also an issue that was brought up during the course of the public hearing on the hotel occupancy tax provision. It's recognizing that there are pre-existing contracts where rooms are already sold for a duration of time, and that the hotel occupancy tax increase from 11 to 13% should not be applicable to that scenario. And I have to also highlight that it would only be reflective of the timeline of any existing contract that is recognized by revenue tax of having met these preconditions, of having been awarded or prior to the enactment of this act, and having otherwise been submitted where a proposal was submitted prior to award. So in this particular case, it's in direct recognition of costs that already have been factored in the sale of a number of the rooms in our tourism industry, and I certainly recognize and understand the concerns of some of our colleagues, Mr. Speaker, but in terms of the unreliable funding source, if we were stable with our visitor numbers, then it could be viewed as a justified argument. But with the anticipated increase in the number of visitors coming in over the course of the next several months and into the beginning of next fiscal year or calendar year, certainly we can anticipate an increase in the hotel occupancy numbers. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask for our colleagues' consideration as it applies to this particular amendment. It's recognizing, it's first of all supportive of a number of businesses who have already consummated and have anticipated somewhat fixed costs associated with the sale of the rooms, and also recognizes pre-existing contracts. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask for our colleagues' consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the second amendment that I'd like to proffer is something that we had discussed offline, and it's recommending to our colleagues that on pages 128 and 129, the appropriations, the separate appropriations for GMHA in the amount of $5 million to correct the deficiencies identified by the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare services, that be extracted from this budget proposal, and that the original legislation that was introduced and publicly heard, that be entertained separately by this body. And likewise with Section 20, the allocation of $1.5 million to the Guam Department of Education. And it's no secret about some of the concerns that have been raised previously with regards to the lack or the insufficient funding that was notified, or in which the superintendent received notification that there was insufficient funds in the TEFF to be able to effectuate this. We also received information from representatives of the administration that they need authorization that is provided in these two particular sections. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask for our members, our colleagues' consideration and your consideration to entertain those two particular provisions separately, as they have been introduced separately and were publicly, both provisions were publicly heard. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Have these amendments been circulated?
Can we have a short recess, Mr. Speaker, so we can review the amendment?
It's just to remove these two pages, and we would have to, at some point soon, entertain 329 and 330 separately. So the question is just to remove it from this budget bill, and we would address it separately in 329, 330 separately at a session of the legislature.
So we will not address those bills that were inserted into the budget during this budget session. We're just removing it.
We're removing it from this, and we'll have to figure out some time to hear it, and hear it soon.
Okay.
If I can, Mr. Speaker, if I can provide a point of information, and I think that this was discussed also previously, is we recognize that by August 6th, any outstanding remittances from the amnesty collections of approximately $15 to $16 million will be realized. And the issue here is ensuring that the measures are presented to the governor in time so that those proceeds or those cash collections are not expended elsewhere. We know that there's an anticipated total cumulative collection of about $33 million, of which have not been set aside in a special fund, so that it would be subject to appropriation. So what this would do is allow this body, if it so wishes, which I ask you for your support, allow us to entertain these measures separately, presented to the governor in time for that particular deadline so that, in fact, he can either act on it and the funds would still be with the government of Guam rather than it being expended and being notified later that the funds are no longer available. So that's the issue. Mr. Speaker, it's subject to the decision of the body, and I certainly recognize that, but I believe that it would certainly help the process in terms of allowing GMHA to receive the proceeds perhaps a lot quicker than the anticipated completion of this budget proposal. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and colleagues.
Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to just speak on Section 17 on the proposed amendment to remove it. Unless we are going into, are we going into a separate session, Mr. Chair? Are we going into a separate session anytime soon to address Bill 329? Is it 329 for GMH?
Right now, no, but we could. I mean, it's all up to the body, but I'm just saying right now, we're trying to get this budget through.
Okay, so I would, on that response, I would object to removing it now. If we don't know if we're going to entertain that bill prior to us trying to pass this, I think it's a safeguard to ensure that that this provision, at least for GMH, is part of a bill that may be entertained for voting before we entertain Bill 329. I believe that's what it is. So, I mean, it's just, I mean, it's not, it's something that needs to be done, and I know there's that time frame that we have, so I don't know what's the, if it's a rush to remove it now without knowing when we're going to entertain those two bills separately.
Thank you. Any other senator? Vice Speaker?
I guess I'm just trying to figure out how feasible that is, Mr. Speaker, that we would act on that prior to finishing the budget bill. If we'd have to, if I know this was declared an emergency, and that's why we're in this session. Could we get a 1-minute recess, Mr. Speaker? I just want to check.
We'll take a short recess. Committee of the Whole is back in order. Senator Egan. On the Egan amendment, anybody else wish to be heard? Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, I would object to removing those two sections from the bill because I believe those add urgency to our passage of this budget. And as you've seen, I've passed out an amendment that would take all the estimated amnesty proceeds that you estimated to be between 15 and 60 and put them into this bill as well so that those are lockboxed for use in 2019, just like these amounts for GMH and Simon Sanchez would be lockboxed for use. And I think if we are able to pass this bill as you seem to have planned before August 6th, then that would be effective. That it would be before the governor at that time, and they would be put on notice that is the source of revenue for the shortfall, Mr. Speaker, from your predictions based on the real property tax. So instead of taxing them or increasing any more taxes, that we mandate that the income that they are going to receive be set aside for this.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? Okay, Senator Egan, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think I've said enough in regards to meeting the timelines of receiving the additional resources, whether it's up to $16 million of the tax amnesty program, and making sure that the Director of DOA, Mr. Burns, certainly meets his commitment. One of the questions that was posed during the public hearing is how quickly will you be able to remit the proceeds? And he said immediately thereafter, paraphrasing his response, immediately thereafter. And I shared with him within a week, and he shook his head in the affirmative. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm just trying to, in this particular case, see what we can do to capture these proceeds so that in actuality, based on the notification that authorization needs to be given or appropriation needs to be provided before the governor's office can transfer money to GMHA to address the CMS requirement and being able to ensure that we don't lose the certification, and also allocating the proceeds so that we can initiate the process for the reconstruction of the Simon Sanchez High School. So that's the purpose of the amendment, and I certainly ask our colleagues to support it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
All those in favor of the Egan amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment fails. Do any colleagues have any amendments that are dealing with cuts that we can address? My plan is that tomorrow we'll try to address concerns that people have of things they believe that need to be addressed. So we've invited Mr. Burns for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We've invited Revenue Taxation for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to answer the question about collections and whether or not that issue is or is not an issue. And your other questions can be addressed at that point also. On Friday, if there are no more amendments as it relates to cuts that people want to impose, I'd like to recommend that we go back to regular order, start at the beginning. If people have some revenue generating amendments that they want to introduce, some revenue generating amendments, including fees. that have been heard can be addressed and specifically earmarked to certain agencies. Let's address them at tomorrow or Friday, or tomorrow morning or on Friday, but let's address them. And I think if we do that, we'll be able to find that with the cuts that have been made, though it's only 27 over the FRP reduction of 30 for a total of 57 for the since 18, it might be sufficient and we may have enough revenue, because I know that some of you have some revenue generating proposals that you wish to make. I have one that I'm going to make in my effort in due diligence to try to raise the funds that I think we need to be able to meet this budget and the budget needs. So if there isn't any further amendments.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've passed out an amendment. I'd like to ask that that be entertained tomorrow morning if we're going to recess until tomorrow. I also just, I guess, want to get an understanding of, there are two provisions in this bill that talk about money that's going to be received on August 6th. And so it's my understanding that you want this to be in front of the governor before August 6th, because after that it would be moot. Is that correct?
I would like to. And let's deal with tomorrow morning. It's been a really long day. So 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Reverend Tax and DOA are here. After that, we can talk about what we can do. All right?
Mr. Speaker, before we end, I just want to ask one point of clarification. In your updated revenue enhancement options that you provided for us, of these options, revenue enhance, I believe that perhaps I misunderstood which options were available to us, that it had in fact gone through a public hearing process. Are all the options that you listed considered to have gone through a public hearing process and are available for consideration?
The only one that hasn't been heard is the increase in the limited gaming.
Okay.
All the other ones were heard in the 230 that the governor withdrew, but it was heard.
In Bill 230, okay, because that was perhaps my oversight yesterday when we were talking about options.
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you. Bill 230, thank you.
Mr. Speaker, so are we going to break? Because I was under the understanding that we would stay till the evening and perhaps we can discuss revenues so that tomorrow morning when we come in, we can get a better idea of what the numbers look like.
I'm game. I'm willing to stay till 10. We've had colleagues that are complaining that others have left and didn't want. I don't know. I'm game to continue the discussion.
Okay. I don't want to hold the body
If
hostage.
there
but
isn't, then
I thought this was an emergency budget. This was urgent.
no,
and so-
I'm game. I'm just saying, all right, fine, we're not breaking. If you want to chair, can one of you chair? I have an amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, can we, if we are going to make some significant decisions, I would request that all the members of the body are here so that we can ensure that there are enough votes and input on these measures. This is an
Let's
emergency
start the
budget.
discussion, and maybe we'll have to call everybody back. But I mean, we need to start the discussion.
Thank you, Mr.
and-
Speaker.
We'll take a short recess. If somebody will chair, I have an amendment.
Thank you.